So first, we have a practice at UCR Palm Desert to open events with a land acknowledgement. So I'm going to begin with that. We at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and to work on these homelands. I am Michael Alexander. I am faculty in the Religious Studies Department, or this Department for the Study of Religion. I'm the Maimonides Chair in Jewish Studies, and I'm very glad to be back here for a new year filled with talks and ideas. Initial thanks have to go to UCR Palm Desert, Tamara Hedges, and the team for hosting us, having Muhammad Ali and I back. Thanks to UCR CHAS and to our new Dean, Darrell Williams. We welcome you. And a special shout out to our Dean of Development, Clyde Derrick, who supports us through everything, basically. So if folks do not yet know Dean Clyde Derrick, I hope that you will, especially as live events come, as they will in the winter. Before I hand the floor over to Professor Muhammad Ali for the honor of introducing our guest, allow me just a moment to thank Muhammad and the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies program for co-hosting the event. Together, we also want to acknowledge those students who are attending this evening from UCR's Middle Eastern Student Center and from the Hillel, and of course, students and faculty from all across campus who, for good reason, care about tonight's topic. For some time, Professor Ali and I have hoped to bring knowledgeable people to campus to speak about this crucial subject, by which we mean Israel and Palestine and their possible futures, what they may be. In other words, Dr. Ali and I want to hear from all kinds of perspectives, from all across the range of national and religious positions. We only ask that speakers come to us in the spirit of moving things forward, by which we mean toward better conditions, toward more equitable conditions. So our remarkable guest, Mr. Rabea Eghbariah, is indeed moving Israel and Palestine forward, especially in the equitable application of the law. Tonight, we're going to learn how. He has presented some of his arguments regarding human rights and civil rights before the Israeli Supreme Court. And tonight, he will present some of his thoughts to us, and I can't wait. So this is great. Now let me allow me to introduce my co-host, my colleague, my dear colleague, Professor Muhammad Ali, who has welcomed a new baby recently and has family leave, and yet he's still with us tonight. He is the director of the program in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. He is faculty along with me in the Department of the Study of Religion. His expertise studies Islam and politics. He has a remarkable expertise, which is Islam and democracy. The Indonesian democracy that he knows so well has 270 million domestic democratic citizens, and 230 million of them are Muslim. So Professor Ali knows a great deal about Islam and democracy, and I am especially excited to hear his own questions and his views regarding today's subject. So Dr. Ali, would you please take the honor of saying a few words and introducing our guest?
Thank you so much, my wonderful colleague, Michael Alexander. It's been always an honor to be part of these conversations. And this is not the first and certainly not the last that we can have about so many issues touching so many problems and peoples around the world. I'm honored to introduce our speaker today. Rabea Eghbariah is a human rights attorney with Adala, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel, for which he has argued cases before the Israeli Supreme Court. He will speak about Palestinians and the Israeli legal system, highlighting land ownership cases, including the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. We hope he will also tell about his most recent cyber unit case. Mr. Eghbariah is currently a doctoral candidate at Harvard Law School. We have named this event Land and Law in Israel, Palestine, a conversation with Rabea Eghbariah, human rights attorney. Welcome, Mr. Rabea Eghbariah.
Thank you so much, Muhammad, for these kind words and introduction. Thank you, Michael, as well, for opening this session. I'm really excited to be here. I really hope you're hearing me well. I woke up feeling a little bit under the weather today, but I'm really excited to be here, and I think it's an important conversation we're going to be having. I always feel that it is important to address this subject, and so I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, we know that your voice is probably strained from all the events and things that you've been doing recently. I know that you keep current, as it were, and so we're glad to be part of your busy schedule. I have the honor of the first question, and it's really about getting to know you. You're an interesting person. We don't. A lot of folks here don't know much about you. Where are you from? What is your family history? We saw on your resume that you in fact started in computer science and somehow you ended up arguing in front of the Supreme Court of Israel. That seems like a kind of a long, strange trip. And then you end up at Harvard University pursuing a doctorate. So if you would tell us something about your journey to the law.
Yeah, well, thank you, because usually people don't ask a lot of questions about personal backgrounds, and I think it's useful to kind of, I would try to use the time to basically tell where I come from and contextualize it in a wider context that will help us, get going into our conversation about the wider issues at stake. So I was born in Haifa, which is a city that is considered so-called mixed city, one of a very few so-called mixed cities in Israel itself, and where Palestinians and Jewish communities live adjacent to each other. And I'm critical about this terminology already, and I want to note that, because, and I say adjacent because typically these cities are not really mixed in the sense that the word or terminology may imply, but in fact they are internally segregated, where Palestinian parts of the cities are usually underdeveloped or de-developed and suffer from substantially worse infrastructure and accessibility to resources. So having said that, I think this already gives us an idea about the reality of Palestinian citizens in Israel. So this already implies I come from a background that is, I'm a Palestinian, my identity is Palestinian, but I'm also legally speaking a citizen of Israel, which today is almost 20% of the Israeli citizens, and I will touch upon that later, are in fact Palestinians. And talking about history, you asked me about my family history, and I think this is, again, a crucial point to eliminate, that the history lives with us today. So my grandparents from both sides are Nakba survivors. Nakba is the word literally means catastrophe in Arabic, and it's a term that Palestinians adopted to describe and frame what happened for them, for their experience in 1948, which is the year when Israel was established in a process and at the expense of displacing most Palestinians from their homes. In 1948, more than 750,000 Palestinians were displaced, ousted from the country, or the geographic unit that was known as historical Palestine under the British mandate up until that moment became, the overwhelming majority of Palestinians became either internally displaced or refugees in neighboring countries like Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. In fact, part of my family is until today refugees in Syria that I have never had the chance to meet. My grandmother was one that managed to stay. She was actually in Haifa in 1948. She got internally displaced, but managed to stay separated from her rest of their family and managed to stay in what became later Israel overnight and gained Israeli citizenship. So I sent a link for my grandmother's Nakba testimony, and it's a great chance to ask you all if you have the time or interest to go and listen to that, but also to Zukhrot, which is the NGO that works on documenting Nakba testimonies. It's actually an Israeli NGO that is working on popularizing awareness about the Nakba, mainly among Israeli public. And so I highly encourage you to check them out. There is this link on the chat, but also they have plenty of other videos, other testimonies that remind us and inform us about what is how the past is interconnected to the present, and how our experiences, our human condition today is very much related to what happened earlier. So having said that, and I've touched much more about my family history perhaps than myself, you know, as I said, I grew up in Haifa. I attended high school, born and raised there, but my parents did not come from there. As I said, most, I think it's a point where to contextualize, there is most Palestinians that became citizens of Israel in 1948 or following 1948 were rendered cheap labor in the Israeli market because, and we will talk a little bit more about that, they lost most of the resources, particularly land resources, which reproduced the Palestinians who stayed as cheap labor in the Israeli economy. Now, this happened mainly in the 50s, 60s, the generation of my parents, which were also a generation that was under military rule. Many perhaps don't know, but when Israel was established in 1948, it imposed a almost 20-year military rule upon its Palestinian citizens. And that's an overlooked part of the history when people many times talk about, you know, the occupation or talk about the military rule in the West Bank and in Gaza, which obviously is ongoing until today. But many don't understand that this military rule was an extension of a previous military rule applied to Palestinians inside Israel proper, right? So these consequences of these conditions are still with us today. Today, we're talking about 50% of Palestinians living below poverty line, which is and disproportionate, obviously, to their proportion in the Israeli citizenry. But in this context, I think my parents were one of the few who managed to gain higher education already in the 70s, of the few Palestinians. And that was their way to go to Haifa, where I was born. Yes, absolutely. I went to computer science studies, not really understanding how I ended up there. I finished my bachelor. I loved it. It was, to be honest, it was a part of a program that was a computer science only study program that the school suggested for certain students. And I took that opportunity. I loved it, but then I knew that I wanted to go on and study law. Perhaps I was naive at the time, thinking, you know, law is a very powerful tool to promote social justice. I have a more nuanced, I would say, understanding of the law today after a few years. But yeah, I definitely went from there to study law at Tel Aviv University, graduated, worked as a public defender, joined Adala later, and here I am today at Harvard.
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting history of the family and education. So we have, as we know, this is like a mapping question, right? So there are many perspectives and positions with respect to Palestinians and the state of Israel, whether from Palestinian citizens of Israel like yourself, or from people in Gaza, West Bank, or the Palestinian Authority, or Palestinians in the broader diaspora, right? So you've been in the middle of those conversations at a very high level for quite some time. Can you give us a broad sketch of how you see these varied positions, and where do you place your own position in that discussion?
Wow, Hamad, you know, this is a wide, but important question. I try my best to give an overview to address this situation. So, and again, if there is anything, I can feel free to interrupt me. We're in a conversation, so I'd love to hear where I am perhaps too embedded in my own thoughts. So the way I think about it, to be honest, is that there are certain moments that discourses or dominant discourses around Palestine Israel don't usually get. And there is certain moments that are key to understanding the situation. And one particularly important moment is the Nakba, is 1948. And as I said, Nakba is a word that Palestinians termed or coined for their catastrophe, which describes also the Israelis describe usually as the moment where they gained independence, the establishment of the state. So we already see this tension where there is a clashing consciousness about what happened there in this founding moment of the state. Is it a happy moment, as Israelis describe it, as a catastrophe, as Palestinians describe it? And in the process of the Nakba, Palestinians have been fragmented. So I think this is the key to understanding the Palestinian situation today. Some became refugees, as I said, some internally displaced, others became citizens of Israel. And this fragmentation only became more intense with time, when in 1967, almost 20 years later, after 1948, Israel occupied the remaining parts of Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, right? And imposed further fragmentation through legal regimes that extended to these geographies that are still with us today. So at large, we're talking about 5 different Palestinian fragments today, that are divided across fragmented geographies, but also political statuses, political and legal statuses. And that's my fascination with the idea of what happened, right? The legal fragmentation, the work that the law is doing in fragmenting Palestinian communities, different ones. And so legally speaking, we have broadly 5 different legal fragments: Palestinian citizens of Israel who have supposedly equal citizenship that is rendered, or in fact is a second-class citizenship by many laws and many reports. You can read about this. This is very institutionalized. Studies, including Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, that have recently came out, and with new reports that we can touch upon. But this is one domain or one fragment: Palestinian citizens of Israel. Then you have residents of Jerusalem who have certain proximity to citizenship, but they can't vote. They don't have permanent residency. The residency is subject to revocation. And then there is Palestinian residents of the West Bank who are under military occupation. And when people usually talk about the West Bank, they associate it with the settlements of the Israeli settlements, which according to international law are war crimes, etc., etc. And there is Gaza, which is a further fragment that its situation there is different from the West Bank, from West Jerusalem, from citizens of Israel. And the 5th is Palestinian refugees and diaspora, right? So this is the overbroad, or let's say the overview of the Palestinian fragments today. And the question is, how do we make sense of all of this? How did this complicate our understanding of the reality today? And what is important here again to stress is the interplay between the past and the present, right? This fragmentation did not stop and opened a new page, but rather the Nakba for Palestinians is not a past event. It is an ongoing reality, an ongoing process. It is a framework that explains the material conditions or the material dispossession of Palestinians all across the years until 2021. And I want us to place this, to step a little bit back perhaps, and place this discussion in even a wider context, right? Because what fascinates me really, I lived, as I said, I was born and raised in Haifa, and in many times I speak Hebrew by the nature of being an Israeli citizen as well. The conditions of life there, if you want to go to university, you have to speak Hebrew, etc. And so many times I feel that I grasp this parallel consciousness of many Israelis or people in the West that think about the situation. And it is important to contextualize it in perhaps a wider historical context, right? So this is the thing. Israel, when it was established based on a political ideology named Zionism, right? And it's a political movement that was established in Europe, end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, as a self-determination kind of movement for Jews in Europe itself, following intense waves of persecution of Jews in Europe, and the rise of anti-Semitism there. But this again happened this is way before also Nazism came to power, right? This is end of 19th century. And this comes against the idea that was very popular in Europe of nationalism, right? And creating nation states, and a very, very unspoken word today, colonialism. And colonialism was a very fashionable phenomenon in Europe back at the time. And it is against this background that the idea or the political ideology of Zionism as a solution to the situation of Jews in Europe became popular, and it grew against the background of European colonization more broadly. That is how I place it. This is how I understand what happened in Palestine. Now, obviously, with the rise of Nazism and anti-Semitism, even more in the 1930s, but way before that, the situation of Jews was already referred to by many European circles, including Jewish circles in Europe, as the Jewish question. And the idea what to do with that situation was the motive or underpinning the idea of the political ideology of Zionism, which is to propose a solution in the form of a nation state for Jewish people. And here's the core of the things, I think, the parallel, again, the tension between Zionism being a self-determination national movement for Jewish people, fleeing Europe from persecution, and a colonial movement at the same time for Palestinians who underwent the process or were dispossessed along the process of establishing this nation home for Jewish people in Palestine. Now, and the question becomes, for me, is it justified to ethnically cleanse and fragment Palestinians to establish Israel and achieve that goal? And I think this is a question that is not put that way many, many times. We many times discourses, especially in the West, dance around it. But I really think this is at the core of the things by the end of the day. And let us be clear. The question is not whether Jewish people deserve self-determination or not. Personally, as a Palestinian, I think really I have no say in that. And it is a matter for the Jewish community itself to decide what form of, or what the stake is there. But I do have a say in whether this self-determination comes at my expense and at the dispossession of my people. And comes at the expense of blocking Palestinian self-determination as well, fragmenting Palestinian polity, society, etc., and imposing a violent military occupation or using the law for this purposes of further fragmentation. And again, this is the duality that for me is at the core of the debates usually, or the understanding of the situation in Palestine, Israel, which is the tension between Zionism as an underpinning ideology or political ideology, being both colonial or settler colonial and national at the same time. Having this history in mind, I believe, is important because it informs many different stances that we may hear today. And I don't think we can understand these stances, all these slogans about one-state solution, two-state solution, right of return, settlements. All these, by the end of the day, tie to this key moment, I think, of figuring out how do we resolve that tension, right? How do we resolve what the dispossession, the Nakba, the conditions that produced the Nakba for Palestinians, while at the same time the narrative in the consciousness of many Jewish people is that they really believe, that this was necessary, and I think this is the core of it when we talk about it. I personally, and we can talk about it more later, do not think that the terms, in terms of like stances, and you will find many, many different stances and stakes across Palestinians, whether within Israel itself, West Bank, etc., etc. I don't think that there is a unified, consensus among each fragment as for how to move forward from here. But I personally think that talking about states, I do not believe that, the talk about states is necessarily productive. I do not believe in state solutions. I do believe that we have to address the solutions that create conditions for human dignity. And that is the core, not only for Jews, not only for Palestinians, but for everybody, for the human condition, for the human dignity.
All right. So, I'm actually heartened to first of all, I'm glad to learn of your position and your point of view so clearly articulated, and I'm heartened to realize that I teach a class on the state of Israel, and I'm not in the trenches the way that you are, and certainly do not have the experience with the Israeli legal apparatus or just living there that you have. But I'm heartened that I actually sort of teach the class very similarly to the way that you present it. I have to say that I was your conceptualization. There were two conceptualizations that I found very, very prescient and helpful for me that I'll probably bring into the classroom. The second actually is the idea of there are 5 fragmented legal positions, which I find fascinating. And I guess you spend most of your time sorting those out, and sort of dealing with that reality, those legal rubrics for different for one people, but 5 different legal positions. So that I found very interesting. But the thing that I found sort of almost more, not more so, but differently interesting, is that you talk about the military and police control of minorities in Israel, starting with the Nakba of 1948, or maybe even a little bit earlier, and say that it's even before the 1967 war, that on the minority populations, I presume mostly in the north of Israel, but all over the place, that the new Israeli state has a majority, but it also has a minority problem. In other words, if you're trying to build an ethnically based nation state, that's great if everybody is in that state is of the majority. But as we all know, that's not only a fantasy in Israel and Palestine, that's a fantasy everywhere on the planet. Meaning that when the Ottoman Empire fell apart and when the British Empire fell apart, many different ethnicities, hundreds if not thousands of them, were left scrambling for a piece of land where they were not yet ethnically cleansed. And the Jews took a piece of land. Part of it is colonial, as you point out. Part of it was people that lived there. They all considered it home, and you articulated that you recognize that Jews don't, they see it as a kind of return home. But nevertheless, in the creating of the state, they created minorities, and it's not the only place in the world with a minority problem. The United States of America, during COVID in particular, we all see that we have a minority. We have problems with the way that the majority legally treats minorities, militarily treats minorities, policing minorities. It's sort of a systemic issue. Now, that does not take away at all from the egregiousness of what your own experience was, or what the situation is in Israel, which is part of the reason that I am excited to have you here. I want to hear your point of view on how to work through these issues, which are how do minorities survive in conditions where there are pressures for them not to speak and sometimes not to exist. So you said a lot of things that got me thinking I should do less talking. And this is, you are our guest, but I wanted to sort of mention that. Now,
if I can jump here, Michael, this is fascinating for me. And I think this is an opportunity. This reminded me, first of all, what you're saying. I have a couple of things to say about that, actually. First of all, it reminded me, the historical argument about how nation states are established through the process of creating minorities. It reminded me of a book, a really great book by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani, released last year, I believe. It's called Neither Settler Nor Native. And if I, just put it shortly, that the whole historical argument of this is that he goes from one, it's a comparative study, that the arch of it is that the process of creating the modern nation state has entailed minoritizing certain communities. And I think this is absolutely true. I mean, in the US, which is also a settler colony, you know, we started by land acknowledgement today, but also, you know, in other countries like South Africa and New Zealand, Australia, perhaps. So the idea, I think this touches on the idea of like, true, we are, the question of minority in Israel in particular is important because it's a question of, I believe, you know, it's a minority relatively to what, right? It is a minority if you take the basis of comparison to be Israeli citizens. So Palestinians are definitely minority, 20% minority, which is a large minority if you take the basis of comparison to be the citizenry. But the situation becomes definitely more complicated, again, in light of these different fragments that we talked about, in light of how the history informs of our understanding of this situation of this minority, that this minority was not, you know, it is a minoritized population, right? That does not necessarily perceive itself, or many people don't really perceive it themselves as minority in Palestine, Israel. Because if you take a look, a wider look that considers also Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem into the equations, which are three different, again, geographical legal fragments that are subject to Israel, different or varying degrees of Israeli control, the situation becomes very different, right? You have then 50-50% almost situation of Palestinians, Jewish Israelis. Now, one more thing I wanted to actually say, of course, some Jews that were living in Palestine, they were native to the land, for sure. I mean, I don't think it would be intelligible to deny Jewish ties to the land, as well as other ties to the land, right? I think that the question becomes, are these ties exclusive? Are these ties entail any right to dispossess others to practice them? And I don't think this is the case. I also think this is I mean, if we're talking here about the extension of, you know, religious ties is interesting in itself, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jewish, for the sake of it, you know, like by the end of the day, we're talking about the Holy Land, right? So it's interesting, the way I see it interesting, what is happening and how people understand themselves today in 2021 as something that is like, you know, extending 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. I think that these identities have, or our understanding of identities today has developed or changed. And many times this argument of ancient times, right, is a very characteristically central to national movements in general that try to establish themselves as prehistorical or as, you know, ancient nations. But in fact, these identities are manufactured in the last 200, 300 years, right? Like the whole concept of nationalism. But having said that, I also wanted to note that the idea of, or the terminology of Arab Jew, for example, if we take this, and perhaps, I don't know if the audience is even familiar of this, you know, which is Jewish communities that lived in Arab states for centuries, and they were speaking Arabic, they were religiously Jewish, such as well as, you know, many Arabs can be, you know, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Druze, many different religions. But in the process of establishing Israel, this identity became impossible in some sense in the Arab world. And so from Arab Jew, you had this bifurcation of Arab and Jew, right? And these became supposedly parallel or contradictory identities today, that it is even almost impossible to talk or imagine or recreate this identity of an Arab Jew that exists in harmony, these two components as if they exist in harmony together. So I think this is definitely interesting. You know, we can talk for hours about it, I believe.
Yeah.
But that was my initial reaction to it. If I have one more minute, I do want to I wrote down here to mention something, because many people have been talking about it lately. You know, when you talked about the different fragments, etc., a lot of talk has been happening recently in the legal community, international legal community, about the use of the term apartheid, following the Human Rights Watch report released last year, accusing Israel of committing the crime of apartheid, which is an interesting place to note that there is no such thing, legally speaking, an apartheid regime. There is a crime of apartheid that is prohibited, right? So it's a practice. And many people have sort of thought, you know, like, is this a breaking point? Even the title of the Human Rights Watch report is a threshold crossed, right? So it's a matter also of time that comes, you know, as if there was a consequence or a cumulative kind of process that crossed a certain threshold. I want to place this very briefly in the wider context of that I talked about, and say that for the Palestinian experience, these frameworks are not new. Palestinians have talked about precisely the Israeli and Zionist movement as movement of settler colonialism and apartheid since the 60s and 70s, right? And so it's interesting how these kind of frameworks of understanding are making a return suddenly in 2021. And they are really opening the door, I believe, to genuinely address what is at core and what is at stake here, because I don't think we can move forward without, you know, considering the genuine understandings of Palestinians.
So, Mohammed, maybe you could get us, you know, this has been great, and I've been getting a lot of history and also a lot of conceptual, you know, understanding here, but we want to get to what you do with Adala. So can you, you know, I know Mohammed has a question regarding that.
Oh, yeah, sure. So, you know, situating this wonderful, but your work with, you know, this organization, Adala, you know, the Legal Center for Arab and Minority Rights in Israel, which since the turn of the century has been the primary human rights organizations run by Palestinians that advocate for people really across Israel, Gaza, the Palestinian Authority, right? And we know that there are parallel Israeli-founded organizations. You know, Bethlehem is one, and we hope to invite some of the representations or representatives to speak to us as well next time. But what is your experience with Adala? What do they do? What do you do with them? And especially, have you seen any progress toward more equitable conditions through Adala's work?
Yeah, thank you for this question again. But I think, you know, Adala, I think it's illuminating to start with saying Adala means justice in Arabic. And that's the core of the idea of the organization, you know, to distinguish, I think, justice from law, because many times they are conflated. And I believe that this, you know, conflation between justice and law has worked on me as well. When I first, as I referenced, you know, went to law school believing, you know, if I work the law right enough, everything is going to be fine. It didn't happen to be the case. So Adala was established in the 90s against the background of back at the time, you know, many civil society organizations were established, Palestinian civil society organizations in particular. Adala was one of them, and it was, I think, some sort of a reaction or a development that came against the background of the Oslo framework or the Oslo peace process that was starting at the time, which eventually exploded with the, you know, came to its demise, I believe, in the second Intifada that broke out a few years later in 2000. And this is where I think the name is interesting way to kind of also tie it to our conversation, because the name of Adala is the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights, right? And we were just talking about, you know, what is this terminology all about? And I believe that today, 20 years later, reflecting at this as a more junior, attorney that joined Adala much later than when it was founded, I see it as an interesting episode in how, you know, history developed and the situation today, to also understand that the things are not static, they're always dynamic and developing. And I think there's it's a matter of, you know, the name stuck in the sense of back at the time, the whole framework of a two-state perhaps was more viable or more talked about or more central, in which there was an idea of, you know, two perhaps separate concepts of, you have Israel proper with an Arab minority right? Which is also conceived differently, perhaps, from Palestinians or Arabs, Palestinians in Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. But and there's a huge but. I think with the time when it evolved. So and this is not necessarily exclusive to Adala. Many organizations or political movement that were founded in the 90s carried a similar discourse of right within the framework of citizenship. But as time went, and this framework of a two-state proved to be kind of dead today, Adala's remit as well as legal work started to expand in parallel to the expansion of the political conversation that is happening, right? So in Adala, we as a legal center do legal interventions, petitions, represent in UN and international forums the interest, or we try to protect Palestinian rights, mainly through litigation. So the focus of our work, or Adala's work, is litigating cases. The main forum we have accessible is Israeli courts. We do it in relation not only to Palestinian citizens, but in fact, again, pertaining to Palestinians across these different fragments in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, with a certain focus on Palestinian citizens, definitely. And the work spans from civil and political rights, land and ownership or land and planning rights, to social and economic rights. I personally worked more on the civil and political division of it, I litigated cases that pertain to freedom of speech or the censorship of online content, which you referenced, the cyber unit case, which we can talk about, but as well as criminalizing Palestinian political leaders, prosecuting them under the pretext of incitement or terrorism-related provisions, which is a good point to reference. Perhaps you've been hearing in the news the designation of the 6 Palestinian civil society organizations lately, this past couple of weeks, basically, as quote-unquote terrorist organizations, a move that Israel took last month, and that spurred a lot of contentions and criticism, and it is an ongoing debate around it. Actually, in fact, even the White House demanded clarifications on that point. These organizations include the 6 leading organizations in the West Bank, including Al-Haq, a word, the oldest Palestinian civil society organization, in fact, and many others. So this is a point where to eliminate how also anti-terrorism legislation is many times used, or the law is used to prosecute Palestinians. That's in general. I mean, feel free if you have any questions in particular, or if you're interested in that I elaborate on any of the subjects.
Well, maybe I can. So we've had some questions from the audience that actually are confluent with some of the questions that Mohammed and I have. And so they're interested in real estate. We have some real estate people in the audience, especially some of our folks in Palm Desert. You have done, listen, nationalism is about land and the control of land. And you have really been, in the courts trying to figure out who has the right, who doesn't have the right to have land, who can move people out of land. So, and we all know, as you talked about, the May violence regarding especially Sheikh Jarrah and movements in the Israeli legal system to move out Palestinian people from homes in Sheikh Jarrah. So you have worked on this case with Adala, cases regarding it. You wrote a brilliant piece about Palestinians and Israeli real estate law that got picked up by some of the important blogs. I'll drop it in the chat right now. And in that piece, you compared 3 sites of land locations of difficulty, including Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood, which the one that made the news. and it's the one that really stirred trouble in May, and also it brought out unprecedented levels of protest among Palestinians, the Sheikh Jarrah moment. It brought out some scary nationalist responses from the Israeli right. And so for us lay people who sort of wanted to understand what happened and why so many people were upset about the Sheikh Jarrah moment, tell us, please, your argument, your legal conception in the article regarding land and rights. And yeah, if you could just talk to us about how Adala has helped you sort of think through some of these issues.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michael. I just want to clarify, I was not the lawyer in the case of Sheikh Jarrah.
Okay.
And Adala is not the lawyer in the case of Sheikh Jarrah. It is a case that has been ongoing for years, in fact, and I think it's an interesting point where, you know, public attention came at a certain point that, you know, highlighted the case. But this is already an entry point to understanding that this case, as important as it is, it's only a microcosm for what is happening in land cases. And similar situations have been really in and out of courts since the 60s, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s. In fact, Sheikh Jarrah itself has been litigated in courts since 1972. So we can see that the court system has been very active in all sorts of frameworks, legal frameworks pertaining to land ownership and etc. And I can talk a little bit about my idea. I just want to first, because, you know, to clarify about the Sheikh Jarrah case, which I've been following closely. Again, I was not the lawyer. Adala is not officially representing the families of Sheikh Jarrah. And Adala did represent, not myself personally. There is two amazing lawyers that work in the land and planning unit. Shout out to Suhad Bishara, my colleagues Suhad Bishara and Maysana Mourani, who have represented families in Al-Hiran and other cases that I mentioned in my article, that I kind of draw a parallel or a comparison between them to understand what is happening here, right? And so I think we established the idea of, or my approach to understanding as like the legal fragmentation, to understand that there is here different legal frameworks at play at different geographical fragments or different, yes, basically. So you have Al-Hiran case, for example, is a case that pertains to Palestinian communities in the Naqab Desert in the southern of Israel. So they are Palestinian citizens of Israel. The framework that applies to them is a different framework from what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And there's yet more frameworks that apply in the West Bank or in other cases that make it to the court pertaining to Palestinian displacement. But what I think my argument in that piece was to examine these different frameworks and to extract some unifying logic that I suggested to term as Jewishness as property under Israeli law, drawing obviously, you know, whoever went to law schools perhaps is familiar with the Cheryl Harris formulation of whiteness as property. And so I was drawing on that strand of critical thinking and to conceptualize what the law is doing in Israel-Palestine in the way it is manufacturing Jewishness as the key to state lands, to property, to land in general, to the distribution of resources. And we can see that this is a thing that the courts are protecting and in fact formulating, while at the same time the legislator is also enacting certain laws that allow this distinction. And so again, the idea, tying it up perhaps to what we were talking earlier, Jewishness in the context of Israel is not only a religion, right? It pertains to nationhood or nationals, right? So there is according to Islam, legally speaking, there's a distinction between citizenship and nationality in Israel. These are not overlapping concepts. These are not identical concepts, which is a weird situation, right? Usually, if you're a citizen, you're a national. In Palestine, Israel, you're not even you're not a national necessarily. If you are a citizen, you're not necessarily a national. The Supreme Court of Israel defined nationality. It in fact said that there is no such thing Israeli nationality, but rather Jewish nationality. And this obviously creates, again, a two-tiered citizenship, right? Because Israel, as constitutionally defines itself as a Jewish and democratic. This is the phrase, right? This is the coined phrase of Jewish and democratic character of the state. And then this led to, many cases litigating what does that even mean, is Jewish incompatible with democratic, if you put it that way, given that there is non-Jewish citizens, etc., etc. I personally believe that really, these two terms cannot be construed in a way that is non-discriminatory, right? You either be fully democratic, but what is a Jewish and democratic that does not produce a discriminatory outcome? And the Supreme Court has really struggled with answering this question, and the Supreme Court as an institution has been identified generally, at least in the beginning, early 2000s, and today it's changing as an institution, its perception, its legitimacy, its status in Israeli society itself. But it has at least generated some sort of a liberal veneer of perception towards outwards, right? And still, even this liberal segment of the elite that struggled with this question with the Israeli elite has not yet came up with a convincing answer to this challenge, which is a legal question, right? And so I think, given that context, this is what produces Jewishness, again, as a conflated, not only religious, but also a national identity in the context of Israeli law, as a property concept. It is when you trace different legal disputes that are happening, whether in Sheikh Jarrah, whether in al-Hiran, whether in Khan al-Ahmar, which is a Bedouin community in the West Bank, and plenty other cases. There is a line that crisscrosses all these cases and crisscrosses all these different legal frameworks, which is a line that prioritizes Jewish and state title to the land at the expense of dispossessing Palestinians, regardless of how long they have been on the land, regardless of their presence on the land, their claims to the land. And so we see the Supreme Court engaging with this framework in different. The Sheikh Jarrah case, by the way, has not been decided yet. It has been argued in last August, and in fact the escalation of violence that happened in May, it was partly, obviously, Sheikh Jarrah played a huge role in that story. It was not the only spark that led to that, but the court orders were supposed to get enforced by May, and that's, I think, what catalyzed the situation. The court eventually postponed its hearing until August to try to buy time, basically, until things cool down. And it was heard then. There was a proposal to settlement between the parties. The parties rejected that, stressing the Palestinians, particularly the parties' families, stressed their right to the land and the right to their homes there. And they basically stressed that they are not willing to compromise their rights. The settlement, or the deal that the court suggested in the case of Sheikh Jarrah, was basically granting the Palestinian residents there some sort of protection for the next few years, up until a generation, but at the same time acknowledging that the property rights reside with the Tahalat Shimon, which is the settler organization funded by the US, I don't know how many of you, saw that viral video that circulated in May with New York settler Jacob, who said to the Court family, if I don't steal it, someone else will, right? And this really became a viral, and I think this captures, getting back to the idea of Jewishness as property, I think this captures really the core logic that the legal system produces here. The legal system is rewarding Jacob in that case, right, as a claimant of Jewishness as property, although he knows that he himself acknowledges, I stole that house, right? He's saying, this is not mine. I came from New York. I stole that house, but I am rewarded basically as a claimant of Jewishness as property, because he says, if I don't steal it, someone else will. Based on what logic? And this is what creates, this is the infrastructure, the legal infrastructure that enables these kind of cases, that enables, in my eyes, what enables recreating Jacob, or a stealer basically, as the owner of the property at place. So I don't think that, and there's been a lot of heated debate, especially among Palestinians themselves, that say, this is not a real estate dispute, this is an ethnic cleansing case, which I think is perfectly fine to call it that way. I do think, however, that real estate disputes in this case are used, or disputes or legal disputes more generally, the law is used here as a method of this ethnic cleansing, as a method of this dispossession. These are not contradictory terms in my eyes. And so this is my view of the situation, how property disputes are adjudicated in Israeli courts. And I think it's interesting to highlight, or to contrast it with how Jewish disputes for example, the settlement, the relocation of settlers from Gaza, when they were evicted from Gaza, the court dealt very differently, legally speaking, with their claims. Their claims were adjudicated as claims under property rights, right? While Palestinians cannot even formulate their claim to property to begin with. And I think this is the organizing framework, and this is an organizing framework that, regardless of legal status, when it comes to land, which is the material condition upon which the state is established, the racialized distribution of land is just starking.
Well, this is even more important, and I think it can stimulate so many questions. We wish that we had more time, but we almost right. So when we end in at 7, or Michael, what is about the timeline?
I'd like to stay on a little bit more. If people need to go, they can go, but I'd like to keep Robbie here to ask him some more questions.
Sure.
Mohammed, why don't we, we'll hit 7:15 or so. We'll hit him with 2 more questions. If I see something in the Q&A that makes sense, we can throw that in. But why don't you take the next question? And maybe Rabea is a very fine lawyer. Maybe there's a way you can weave in your discussion of the cyber unit into whatever your answer is at the next question.
Sure, try that.
Yes, please. So basically, this is about the future, right? So we try to connect the past and the present, right? So that's how we frame these conversations. And I think, legal dimension of these questions and problems and possible positions, all these contradictory positions, and formulating the question themselves. So what is next, right? So the question is, what is next? So our Middle Eastern Islamic Studies program and the students served by the Minoritizing chair very much want to ask an array of thoughtful, engaged actors, such as yourself, about possibilities for a more equitable future in Palestine, Israel, and also the dominated locations, occupied territories. What do you see as the most helpful and possibly realistic path forward toward more equity, justice, less violence, more human rights, right? So how do you see this? Of course, you can also discuss the cyber unit that also related to this question as well.
Yeah, so yeah, the cyber unit is a fascinating case study, to be honest, of justice, perhaps. That's I would, or the lack thereof, right? But I will start by saying, about the future, about imagining different futures. I think the word imagining is important to bring to the conversation. How do we, I do think that the past is an important to consider, to inform our understanding of the present. But ultimately, if we want to imagine new futures, we have to look forward. And I think the way forward is taking first an honest look at reality, is grappling with the past, is candidly hearing Palestinian voices. And I want to thank you today, because many times Palestinian voices are not centered in these conversations. And engaging with these efforts toward a real, candid, genuine solution. I briefly mentioned before that I do not believe in state solutions, in the sense of, it's not that I don't believe in the state structure necessarily. I do not believe that the words or the slogans, one state, two state, are productive for us to really, or say anything substantial about the system itself. It can be two states system that is inherently corrupt and unjust and as bad as a one-state system. So I don't see that states here are the key word, but rather, again, moving forward with a deeper reconciliation and understanding. And my go-to preference would ultimately be a one-state solution. If that is, like, why not? Why not a state for all citizens, whether Jewish or Palestinian or Arab or whatever, however they want to define themselves under that. But then again, this does not say much about the nature of that state, right? And I really think that if we want to really move forward, we have to start with imagining a different reality. I think that a new reality has to pass through different, or let's say the 3 R's, let's say, right? So it has to pass through recognition, right? Recognizing the past injustice, for Palestinians, recognizing the Nakba in particular as an ongoing process. And we've talked about that today. I think the second R would be redistribution, right? Redistribution of resources, redistribution of accessibility, and particularly land resources, accessibility to land, to enable Palestinians to claim the lands that they have been redispossessed from, or to at least to try to formulate some sort of system. I mean, we cannot deny the claims of Palestinians or not engage with them if we want to reach any solution, right? And the situation has been pretty much, even since Oslo, right, that Palestinian lands have been diminishing, or the accessibility of Palestinians to land, even in the West Bank, has been severely diminishing. The number of settlers in the West Bank has doubled since the Oslo peace process started, which is an interesting way to think about these process, right? It was initially a process that was supposed to put an end to settlement. But in fact, even before the second Intifada, the numbers of settlers increased dramatically during the 90s. And this can already tell us something about the design, or the flaws in the design of that process to begin with, or the asymmetry that is still playing until today. So I think recognition is a way to start, redistribution is a way to start, but also reconstruction. Which is working to reconstruct the regime, working to reconstruct the polity, to transcend the idea or the institutionalized ethno supremacy that is embedded in the system, and try to move forward from there to a just future. That is how I would think about the future in broad terms. If we want to kind of put it from this abstracted view back into cases, we could go on and talk about the cyber unit or whatever other cases, questions you may have.
Let me just say that I think yes, I think we want to hear it. If people need to leave, they need to leave. We talked about, you know, a 20th century problem which continues in the 21st century, which is land. Now I want you to tell us about a 21st century problem, which is the cyber unit. These people are going to be very interested in, you know, people right now. There's a lot of folks beating up on Facebook, so it's sort of a perfect moment for you to be talking about Facebook, the Israeli government, and some of the stuff that's been going on. So please take 5 or 10 minutes, tell us about what's going on in the 21st century, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, sure. So I think that, you know, the cyber unit case is a case that I litigated with my colleague Fadi Khouri. And you can listen if you want to the podcast. I believe that I sent a link to it prior
I'll
to
put that up right now. I'll put the link in right now.
Yeah, for those interested to know more about the case, I've also published recently an article that talks about that, an academic article. But to make it short, it's a case, really, it's a 21st century case that touches upon digital rights, and it really shows how these, you know, hierarchies are not, or the digital sphere, the online sphere is not free from the reproduction of these hierarchies and state control in this sense. In particular, what we're talking about is an Israeli unit in the Israeli prosecution that is called the Cyber Unit, and it submits requests to social media companies such as Facebook, mainly Facebook, but also 200 other companies as well, and asks them to take down contents that are published on their platforms based on their own terms of service, right? So let's imagine me, myself, being the Israeli Cyber Unit, Muhammad being Facebook, and for that sake, Michael being, you know, just a citizen that is, you know, writing his thoughts on Facebook for that sake, you know, and I, as the Israeli Cyber Unit, let's say I don't like Michael's thoughts, ideas, I deem them even illegal under my law, but instead of going and prosecuting Michael and saying, oh, listen, Michael, this is illegal, you can't do this, I go to Muhammad, which is now, again, Facebook, right? And ask them, hey, Facebook, can you take Michael's post down? It's actually violating your own contractual relation, you know, your own terms of service. And this is a very interesting case, right? Because through this mechanism, Israel is actually succeeding in taking down thousands of content. So and this is a relatively new mechanism. It started in 2016 in the Cyber Unit. By 2019, the number of requests topped to almost 20,000 requests per year. And we're talking about requests that may include various or several pieces of content, including whole videos or whole accounts or whole pages. So it's not a one single post, right? And the compliance rate of these companies has been proven to be very efficient for Israel, or very productive. More than 93% of requests are actually actioned and taken down. Now, the problem here in this case, and what we try to challenge, is the institutional or power relations between the state, for that sake Israel, and between these platforms, for that sake Facebook, in particular, which many of them are actually incorporated or operate offices from Israel itself, which can exert on them taxation, regulation, and many other things, right? So there is like institutional or background incentives for these companies to comply with the state requests, even if it comes at the expense of the user. And the user in our case is typically a Palestinian user, although it is not limited to Palestinians. In fact, the Cyber Unit submits cases or submits requests to take down content globally. So this can also pertain to American citizens, for that sake, right? And it can pertain particularly to BDS content, which is the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement against Israel. But this is all speculation, because, I mean, we know that the unit submits such requests extraterritorially, but we don't know the content of the request it submits because there is no oversight on that cyber unit and there is no transparency as for what content is submitted, neither by the cyber unit itself nor by the companies themselves. And so here is where we started to intervene in this process, and we say, hey, what's up? Basically, we went to court after correspondence with the cyber unit in which we claimed that you cannot legally do this. You don't have any legal authority to submit these to operate this mechanism. And interestingly, back at the time, the prosecution office replied saying that they don't deem this activity a state action because it is subject to the discretion of the companies themselves, right? So they don't think of it as even the state is doing anything wrong. They don't think of it as even the state is exercising any governmental power or any state power, because they say, you know, the Facebook is taking down absolutely under its voluntary terms. And so it's as if the state is acting like any other user to flag content. We obviously thought this was problematic. We went to the court and we lost, as usual. And I'm proud to be, we talked, you know, about Adala, about the legal system. I'm proud to be a loser in this system because really it is very, very, very unusual and hard for us to succeed in cases pertaining to Palestinian rights. The Israeli Supreme Court has, in fact, almost never been a guardian of Palestinian rights. It legitimized the most severe practices and legalized them. And you know, the Supreme Court in particular, and there is books and books written about that, including by Israeli law professors, by the way. And so anyway, talking about this, we went to court, we won the legal, we lost the case, but we won the legal claim that this is state action. So the court actually agreed with us that the state is actually practicing a role here that should be legalized, but it eventually went ahead and legalized it, citing, you know, it was a long decision. I don't want to go into the rationale of the court, and I critique it personally, I dispute it, but it was a long decision citing the security apparatus and the necessity and social necessity and the necessity that the law develops in accordance with technology, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is a very dangerous and unprecedented kind of decision in the digital or online rights sphere that is paving the way for Palestinian censorship. And we've been seeing the results of this kind of cooperation already manifesting. Is talking about Sheikh Jarrah, when everything happened in May, there were plenty of reports about overwhelming censorship of Palestinian content online. And even last month, the Facebook Oversight Board itself suggested that Facebook should inquire into its potential bias with that regard. And so this is the situation. This is the legal case. It was argued in front of the Supreme Court last year. The decision was delivered a few months ago, in March, I believe. And since then, basically, there has been a few developments on the legal side. But it's a matter that is going to continue to accompany us in the near future, at least.
Well, so we've promised you a live trip to our campus in Palm Desert and to our campus in Riverside, and I'm sure events will develop over the course of the next few years. We would like to have you live to sort of talk about, you know, where these things go. You're tired. You've been great. Thank you so much for speaking to us. You know, it's my hope to bring more speakers to campus that have some, you know, positive direction forward, at least in terms of their imagination of a better and more equitable future. I am so glad that you have sort of started us out on the right path here. And Mohammed, maybe you can take us out. Thank you so much, Mohammed Ali, for participating even during family leave. If you have any final words to say to us?
No, I think this is very unique, nuanced, sophisticated, but accessible, from the perspective of legal disputes and all these kind of questions that are so preoccupying so many of us, outside Israel, but of course also within Israel. I think from within Israel itself is so complicated, and I think we, the outside now, we have to understand what's going on. I think Rabea Eghbariah already, present to us these complex issues, but at the same time, some imaginations, wonderful imaginations about recognition, retributions, and reconstruction. I think some of the ways that I think we can learn from our conversations. I wish you the best on your law school there, and thank you so much again. And we all learn so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Okay. Good night, everybody. And remember, Rabea Eghbariah, the next time he comes to us, he'll be Doctor.
Right.
Thanks, everybody, and good night.